Following tradition, I'll be knitting and crocheting my first pair of socks to find out the differences between the two. However, contrary to custom, I will be knitting first this time. And for the usual disclaimer, these are not the only methods, they were just the most generic ones I found. To begin, I'll be knitting from the top down using the tubular cast-on or the sport weight cotton. Sure, kind of an odd choice for several reasons, but for one, it's what I had available, and two, I find that cotton yarn is great for practicing since the stitches are clear to read and the fibers are relatively resilient when it comes to frogging. Isn't there also a saying about blessing cotton socks? Because I'm going to need it. Already, we were off to a turbulent start. The tubular cast-on truly has a chokehold on me, and it's really quite difficult to do anything well when the circulation to your brain has been cut off. Plus, it's just infinitely fiddlier with a lightweight yarn. I was worried it was going to be a little too small, but now that I've taken out the provisional yarn, it looks fine. I was also winging the design as per usual, and I wasn't sure about anything apart from starting the cuff with a 1x1 rib. Admittedly, this didn't turn out so well. In fact, it was kind of bad. The cotton lacked the elasticity required to pull in the stitches, and it just looked messy compared to the plain stockinette that followed. But it was expected, and I only have myself to blame. And it was at this point when I had a very silent meltdown. I accidentally deleted a bunch of footage. Look, I knew from the moment I started making videos that this was bound to happen sooner or later, but no one and nothing could have ever prepared me for the sheer force of anguish, regret, and self-reproach that this turn of events had spiraled into. Okay, maybe I'm being a little dramatic. Just a little. Just know that after some adjustments and a bit of frogging, I eventually broke the round and knit back and forth for the heel of the sock. Next, it was time to turn the heel, and I lost some footage here too. This is possibly the most complicated part of the sock, depending on your experience and preferences, but honestly, it really wasn't bad at all. And I don't know if any of you feel or have felt the same, but the term turning the heel used to confuse me. It was a single thing that put me off knitting socks. I mean, turning the heel into what exactly? The boogeyman? But in truth, it was a perfect example of a bark worse than its bite. If you've never knit socks before, you're literally just making decreases on either side of the heel, which in turn makes it turn 90 degrees. Once the heel had been turned, it was simply a case of knitting and picking up stitches to form a round again. Like I said, simple. Right? Wrong. Disaster has struck. The crucial thing that hadn't occurred to me was that I then had to get rid of all those extra stitches in the following rounds. Instead, I simply carried on in the round, all the while low-key wondering why the sock looked so thick. Again, denial is a river in Egypt, but where do rivers come from if not from the tears of our mistakes? Did you know? Justin Timberlake's 2002 hit Crimea River was actually a National Geographic piece on the formation of waterways. I'm going to unravel it all and make those decreases. Okay, so that doesn't sound so bad. It is and was easily fixed. And in case you were wondering how long this sock took, I actually timed everything and I'll go through it all at the end. Determined to finish the sock before the day ended, I knit like greased up lightning and soon caught up with my previous progress. But, and not the good kind with 2 T's. I ended up making a few too many decreases on both sides because I forgot to factor in the decreases I made for the heel turn, which means that I'm short about 6 stitches. 2 major setbacks I could handle, but this? Are you serious? Houston, we have a problem. I started counting my round just to make sure that everything was okay, and I suddenly ended up with an odd number. So I decided to undo these stitches and pick them back up with 1 fewer stitch. Although now is technically correct, it now looks like this. I feel like if I were to redo this, I would also have to redo this, and in which case I would just have to redo the whole sock. I'm not sure that I want to start all over again, but it just looks so bad. But nonetheless, we shall move forward. In theory and in hindsight, it's super simple. I just keep getting it wrong. With all the stitches and their decreases counted for, I soldiered on, really hoping that 3 was indeed a magic number. I'll admit, all of this could have been avoided had I researched more thoroughly, measured properly, and paid closer attention to the stitch count, but none of that changes the fact that the best lessons are learned through sheer pain and suffering. So now I've finished the length of the sock and I'm going to start decreasing on either side. So I just have to make sure that the stitches on the top side match the stitches on the bottom. With the majority of the sock done, I then tapered the end with decreases on either side. Finally finishing everything off with the Kitchener stitch. And here is the finished sock. It actually looks better than I thought it would, but I wanted to see if I could improve the tension problems in both the rib and the heel. It's definitely an improvement. I also want to add a little heart here because I think that would be super cute. So I'm going to use this yarn and duplicate stitch a little heart. Call me sad, but this was probably my favourite part of the entire sock. Now I'm going to get started on the crochet sock, and I'm just going to use my knit sock as sizing reference. I'll chain this length and then work upwards. For the same reasons as in my glove comparison, I was going to single crochet for most of the sock. I only researched how to do the heel turn for the knit sock and how to do the heel for the crochet sock. So in terms of everything else, I'm pretty much just making it as I go along. I began by chaining and then working into both sides of the chain to form a round. It was at this point that the familiar differences between knit and crochet became apparent once again, so I tried to factor them in while crocheting. I'm a bit concerned about how it will feel in comparison to the knit. I'm not sure that it will be as comfortable, but it actually could be the opposite. And what I've basically done is I've marked my first stitch and my last stitch, increasing in both of these stitches every other round. The crochet is working up a lot quicker than the knit. You can definitely tell the difference in stretch, and truth be told, I was a little worried that I would end up with a comparatively monstrous crochet sock. I had to add a few more increases around here because the crochet just isn't as stretchy as the knit. Although I was expecting it to be bigger, the round grew larger than I anticipated, and I wish I had chained just a few more stitches to avoid such a pointed toe. Nevertheless, it wasn't bad enough for me to redo it, so I didn't. So you can already see that this one is a bit wider, by about 2 centimeters. And I've also incorporated shift stitches to combat the twist. You can always neaten up the joins by slip stitching from the back, but I was keeping it simple. They're working so far. Despite using shift stitches, the round was nowhere near straight. This is still very much the bane of my crocheting life, and I would suggest using a stitch that hides this a little bit better, like the waistcoat stitch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my starting stitch from here to here, and I'll do the same with this one here. The fact that I had to keep adjusting my markers throughout this project was kind of an L, and unfortunately, the simplicity and ease of the project itself didn't really make up for it either, but that's a personal take. On the plus side, the heel was infinitely easier than the knit version, to no one's surprise. I just crocheted back and forth without chaining one at the beginning of each row, which allowed for a smooth edge. I then crocheted back into the round by including the sloped stitches that I would have had to pick up if it was a knit sock, except this was so much less confusing. I was then left with something that looked a little more like a slipper than a sock. All I needed was a candle and a nightcap with a pom-pom on the end. Just to give you a quick comparison between the crochet and the knit sock, you can see that the crochet sock is a little bit wider, like I mentioned previously, but everything else seems to be matching up pretty well. And now you can really see the difference there. Now for the rib, which again was a lot easier this time because instead of fumbling around with the cast on, I just worked vertically, crocheting into the sock edge in place of what would otherwise be a chain 1. It took a long time, but it was as straightforward as it gets. And here is the finished crochet sock. Wait a second. I'd never crocheted a heart on its own before, but I had a rough idea and the magic loop seemed like a good place to start. The first one was too big, but the second was just right. Honestly, I think the duplicate stitched heart was slightly less effort, but they both turned out well. Now for the final comparison. I think it's safe to say that the crochet sock was by far the easier project, as there were just fewer points where things went wrong, and to illustrate just how stark this contrast was, it took me approximately 10 hours and 48 minutes to complete the knit version, and only 8 hours and 41 minutes to finish the crochet version. However, had I not made all those mistakes for the knit sock, it would have taken roughly 7.5 hours. This really surprised me, since crochet generally works up faster than knit, but then I remembered that the crochet sock is larger, and I'm also not a particularly speedy crocheter. In terms of yarn usage, I used less than 50 grams for both socks together, with the knit sock weighing in at 19 grams and the crochet weighing in at just under 28, which is a significant increase. Regarding feel and comfort, I think the knit wins by quite some distance, but this could just be personal preference. The crochet stitches are a lot bumpier and this is exacerbated by the cotton, so I would use a much softer wool next time, as you usually would for socks anyway. Besides, I'll be keeping both of these as reference pieces. If we're talking aesthetics, I think both have their own merits. Although the crochet sock looks sort of clumsy in comparison to the knit, I think it's clumsy in a cute way. But overall, I have to go with the knit sock as it more closely resembles my idea of a sock. Though, I suppose you could argue that's the result of decades of conditioning due to a real lack of crochet sock representation. That being said, if I were to go back in time, I would crochet first to get a better idea of how to structure a sock in the first place. And if I actually wanted to knit some slipper socks, crochet could potentially be the preferable option. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this comparison. Let me know how you feel about making socks, whether you prefer to knit or crochet them, or if you would never even go near them in the first place.